Okay, so the topic we're heading towards now is into early childhood. And just so you know, we usually kind of hit early childhood just before spring break, which is the um, second week in March. So by then, we should be looking at going early childhood to middle childhood and adolescence, which is kind of a combined lecture. So that at the end of spring break, we'll come back and really start looking into adolescence, into adulthood, and whatnot to kind of finish up the semester. So we're kind of right where we should be, but this is kind of where we're at. So early childhood goes from about age two-ish to the age of depending upon the research and the um, uh, how do you say orientation you're in, to about 6 to about the age of 8, depending on what you're looking at. I say that because a lot of the literature goes from about 2 to 6 in the development literature, but the early childhood literature goes from about 2 to 8. So, and we kind of use a combination of those two sources to really understand this period of life. But to start, let's talk about physical development and body growth and change. Okay. One thing that we should note is that in early childhood, physical growth shows slows down in early childhood. If you remember right, if you remember when we talked about infancy, um, uh, the, an infant's size within the first 12 months doubles within the first 2 years. It almost is 3 times as much. So there's a lot of rapid growth during the infancy age, and then we go through a slowdown period. But as you can say, between birth and 6, that we are changing more into our adult body. So if you see, the yellow is the adult, and then represented is the proportion of the age of the child. And pretty much by about 15 and a half, we're pretty close to what our adult figure will be. There's still some changes in the head and whatnot. But even though that it's a slower change because the time is much longer, we do see a lot more growth. We see growth between about the age of 2 to about the age of 6. Body proportions change dramatically. The bones and legs and arms grow more rapidly than the torso, and the head, and the head areas start to kind of become more proportionate to the body instead of being oversized, as you would say. And development of gross and fine motor skills start to really occur. So this is where we start to get that proximal distal um, principle into play, where children are able to grasp objects, or start to be, by about the age of 6, they're able to write their name using those fine motor skills, and able to do more fine movements with their body. Um, there are some risks to develop that is known as developmental coordination disorders. And this is delay in reaching certain motor milestones, and can be improved, but it can be improved with physical education and daily exercise. I make this point right at this because during this period of time of physical growth, things like language are a fine motor skill. Things like being able to color within lines and write name is a fine motor skill. And a lot of parents often tend to get nervous when their children isn't speaking coherently by a certain milestone, or being able to, they say kindergarten should be able to write their name, and those kinds of things. And a lot of parents and even teachers get really concerned when kiddos are behind in that. And while there can be other disorders and stuff that can interrupt that development, really it's about that fine motor muscle skill that tends to be delayed. And things that parents can do. I know this sounds strange that even with language issues, helping kids use their fingers and their toes and all of those and help train through physical activity and physical education, that actually can help even with language issues if it's a fine motor issue and not associated with some other disorder such as autism or a hearing or speech deficit of some type. So um, it's really, but for the majority of the time, it's just that little bit of delay in that fine motor ability. Okay, so this represents here, and this kind of represents the slowing of growth during this period. If you notice, uh, pre we actually lose what's known as our body mass index between this age of about 2 to 6, and then our body mass starts to increase after about the age of 6. Okay. So in this example, 10-year-old boy with a BMI of 23 would be considered things like obese, while one that is 13 would be underweight, and you can kind of see the comparisons in these lines. The main point that I want to express during this period is that it is not uncommon for children to lose body mass, become uh, thinner, and in some cultures, this can be interpreted as the child is not eating enough, they're not having enough nutrients, all of those kinds of things. But that is actually a natural process we go through between the age of 2 and 6. In kind of lay terms, it's when we lose our baby fat and start to gain more lean muscle. And it's kind of that training of the gross and fine motor muscles in our body that often also utilize the quote unquote baby fat we had when we were infants. So it's not uncommon for children to experience a thinning during this period. And within some contexts, it's important to keep in mind that this is normal um, um, and um, not abnormal. Okay. So as our body changes, so does our body awareness. Believe it or not, and I know this is makes some parents kind of worrisome about it, is that by about the age of 2 or 3, children are already starting to develop body awareness, something we commonly call as adults as your body image. Okay. And this is what's called increase in proprioception. And it's an awareness of the body's position in space. Okay, that really becomes refined. And as a child recognizes their size in comparison to other objects and other children and whatnot, they become self-aware of their own body. And so we are seeing, especially well, we're seeing if you look at, for example, Gen Z and Gen X and the generation just before that, where being extremely skinny, the models are very skinny. All the images on TV about being healthy and everything was very fit and skinny people. We found this increased body awareness among children as young as 2 to 3. And it actually, in some cases, we saw children with eating disorders by the age of 4 and 5, as culture became very focused on weight and body size. So that's something to kind of think about when we think about children and natural growth. is that it doesn't start in the teen years or the pre-teen years, what's known as the tween years, where parents often become very concerned about their child's body image. It actually occurs much earlier when the child starts to have this proprioception of their image of them in comparison to others. Okay. We've talked about this. We kind of talked about this when we talked about Freud. The question that comes up with body images is, do children have a sense of sexuality? And the matter of the fact is that again, exploration of the human body is normal. And as children, especially if an area of the body feels really good because of the number of receptors that are in that area of nerve receptors, children will naturally explore those areas more. Um, and this is where, as like we talked about when we talked about Freud and his one of the phases he talked about is talking to your children about the function of body parts rather than the shaming their curiosity is really a much better conversation. Because then if you talk about what those body parts are, why they feel good, then you can implement your family moral base onto that once they have an understanding of why it is that body part responds that way to the child. Instead of dealing with usually parents' own discomfort with sexuality, and so we tend to then shame the child for their natural curiosities. So this is what at least the literature shows. Indeed, I know this sounds strange to a lot of individuals, is that the earlier a child is taught to by parents about things like sexuality and body parts and all of those things, the younger the age, we are finding it has a direct association with the age at which children and adolescents become actively uh, um, um, in, actively involved in sex and sexuality and teen pregnancy. The earlier the child is taught to by the parents in a non-judgmental, non-shaming way about their body parts and about sexuality, the later they tend to engage in sexual activity and even high risk sexual activity. And it's also associated with teen pregnancy. The earlier a child is talked to about these things, the less likely it will be that they will have a teen pregnancy. And the main theory that drives that is that um, uh, most children who get sexually engaged at an earlier age and uh, girls who end up with pregnancy during the teenage is because they don't have a good solid base and understanding of what sexuality is, what it's about, what their body is about. And so the curiosity factor plays a role. And that then puts children at more risk of exploring, especially in high risk situations, at an earlier age. So, kind of an interesting concept that I know makes a lot of adult parents uncomfortable, but there are plenty of books and plenty of resources if you need to know how to engage in those conversations in early childhood. So those are some things to kind of consider when you have a early childhood, if when you have a child or even a someone you care for in those age groups, knowing that they're very, very much aware about their body size, and they do will have this natural propensity to want to explore their body and see what it's all about. Okay. Um, One thing that has had a lot of attention and research and whatnot is childhood injuries and risks. And it's kind of interesting to see some of the changes that we have seen over the decades. And this one goes from about 2000 to 2009. But we can still continue with these rates because the ones that have down arrows that are decreasing are still at very low rates and decreasing. The ones with the up arrows are still fairly high and still fairly common when it comes to early childhood injury and death. Okay. So since about 2000, 2009, we've seen a, a huge decrease in motor vehicle injuries, playground injuries and falls, fires and burns, and drownings. A lot of this can be attributed to public awareness programs, legal programs, such as it was really in 2000 when uh, 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 seat belts and child seats were really enforced. And anyways, yes, enforced between 1990 and 2000s is when a lot of the laws were implemented. But we see in about 2000 is when they were really starting to be enforced. Um, you'll notice though that there are two areas that are still kind of very prevalent, and that's poisoning and suffocation. Mainly because there hasn't what people in especially public health have argued is that there still is not a good public awareness programs about things like suffocation reduction and household poisoning reduction. Oftentimes in early childhood, parents become or caregivers or whatnot become very laxed in, for example, having the locks on the cabinet doors and stuff like that. And also kids are get pretty good at figuring out those childhood locks. And so between that laxing of the caregiver and the natural curiosity of the children, we still see these two as becoming more of the predominant types of injury and death for children. Okay, so some things to kind of think about as far as risk to children. Here, make sure we have good swimming lessons, seat belts, playground safety, and of course, fire and burns have greatly reduced with awareness as well. So what this slide really represents is the interaction between public awareness and implementation within the home. And we see that there's great reductions in many areas, but there's still areas that can be worked upon. Okay. Just some interesting things to think about when we look at abuse. And so we're going to move from childhood injury to what's known as adverse childhood experiences. And as I mentioned, if there's not protective factors that are in place, many of these adverse childhood experiences that you will explore can still negatively influence us as adults. But some of the interesting things that came out of, especially the early findings of the adverse childhood experiences, is the prevalence of abuse. Okay. So we're going to look at two slides. One is going to be reports of abuse, and this one is participants confidentially described abuse or reported abuse. Okay. So you notice that when someone reports these things confidentially, whether it be a child or an adult or whatever, physical abuse and sexual abuse are almost 50% of the abuse reported when it can be disclosed confidentially. Okay. And so you'll see that these tend to be very high risk areas. Okay. And then with emotional abuse and physical neglect and emotional neglect having being the less range. And so, what is the difference between, for our sake, the difference between abuse and neglect? Neglect is withholding something. So usually when we talk about physical neglect, it's not providing enough food. It may be not providing sufficient shelter. It may be not providing physical safety for the child, so leaving them unattended. Those are all kind of forms of physical neglect. Emotional neglect, again, is leaving a child without a secure base, leaving them unsupervised. But a lot of emotional neglect is, for example, neglecting a child's education needs, language needs, cognitive needs. So this is maybe one of the most common examples of emotional neglect is a parent who withholds their child from school for weeks or months without any real reason. Okay, that's emotional neglect. Abuse is the direct use of these three forms of abuse for some type of gratification or need of the abuser. So physical abuse is again, overuse of corporal punishments. I often talk about, what is spanking, right? And there's a lot of debate: is spanking physical abuse, or is it a form of discipline? Okay. And the research is pretty clear on this, is that the line between physical abuse and a disciplinary technique is about the parent's intentions. And I mean intentions when the parent is engaging in the behavior of spanking, because after the engaging in spanking, parents often rationalize their use of spanking. Okay. The issue with spanking is when the parent is using that technique in the moment to relieve their own emotional state. So they're basically taking out their anger and their frustration on the child. That's abuse. However, some evidence does suggest when spanking is appropriate is when the parent is not emotionally aroused and the behavior of spanking is connected to the behavior the child committed and not the parent's emotional, visceral response to the behavior of the child. And so it's almost the reverse of when it's abuse. The reverse, the common is parent spanks because they're personally frustrated, they're angry, they're upset, and then afterwards they come up with some rationalization why they just spanked their child. In reverse, you look at a child's behavior, you go take care of your own emotional state, your own anger, your own frustration, and you decide what is the appropriate consequence. And if that consequence may be spanking, that's would be considered not abuse. Okay. And so I bring up this example because a lot of people ask about spanking and psychology and the psychological welfare of children. And once upon a time, it was spanking is appropriate because it's a form of punishment under operant conditioning. And then there was years in psychology where it was said this has detrimental effect on children. It increases risks for going to jail, blah, 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 based on some other research. And now we're getting to the point where we're seeing, we're seeing that in certain situations, it can be an effective tool, but it's really based on the primary drive of the parent in that moment. Okay. But other forms of physical abuse, of course, is hitting, isolating, physically isolating, all of those kinds of things. Sexual abuse, as you could probably guess, is taking sexual advantage of a young child. Um, this could be done through sexualization. This can be done from direct sexual activity with the child. Okay. And so now this is what confidential self-report shows us. What does reporting show us? Let me back up before we get into the reporting. I do want to make this note about cultures and governmental systems as far as child welfare and whatnot. Okay. Of the 26 modern countries, it should be noted that the United States and China and Great Britain have the worst records of child welfare and abuse. Which means is that we have a low response rate to reports, and B, our interventions for children tend to be very ineffective and not child oriented. Okay. For example, here in the United States, the focus is more on the parent and what the parent is about versus what the needs and the safety of the child are. Okay. So if we compare ourselves to second and third world countries, which often is done in order to make us feel better, our child welfare rates would compare more to places like South Africa or Southern America, but not first world areas like Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and Italy, which tend to have the best child welfare systems. I should note one of the things I do need to take off of this slide is probably Mexico. And while they have a long ways to go, over about the last 15 years, they have implemented a lot of safety nets for children. And so this one maybe need to be taken off the list as a comparison for the United States, because according to the World Health Organization, Mexico has definitely done a lot of work on child welfare and child issues over the last couple decades and have improved their ratings, as you would say, compared to some of the other countries. Okay. Um, with that being said, this is something to keep in mind if you're going into social work, if you have children who are at risk, it's really important to make sure you become that person's advocate, that child's advocate, and be a part of the process and helping, because we don't always make good decisions on the professional end. Now, what about reports? So here in the United States, I said we have a low investigation rate here in the United States, say, okay. So approximately 6.3 million reports of child abuse are reported to Child Protective Services. I'm using the old term CPS because this is nationwide. And I know that different states use different terms now for child protective services, but I'm using that as an umbrella term. But on average, only about 3 million of them are investigated each year. So only a little bit less than half of all cases of child abuse in the United States are actually investigated, mainly due to resources. Um, I really think that for anyone in the class or anyone that works within the child protective areas, you guys are angels. I mean, most CPS workers or child protective workers have caseloads of 50 plus. In some states, they have 100 plus cases that they're working on. And largely because if you're probably wanting to know why only half get investigated, one, we already have overworked protective workers, and with large caseloads, and we just don't invest enough into these systems and hire enough professionals to really meet the needs. Okay. But of the 3 million that are investigated, what they find is that about between the age of 2 and 7, which is the age we're interested in, about 78% are neglect, 18% are physical abuse, 9.3% are sexual abuse, and then that psychological abuse in the survey research, this is what was known as emotional neglect, if you want to make a comparison between that other slide we just looked at. And then an additional 10% experience other types of maltreatment, whether it be food maltreatment, not providing a child with enough food, if they live in a very cold area, sending them to school with a t-shirt and shorts and not clothing them, and those kinds of different things that people see, not bathing, all of those different types of maltreatments make up about that other 10% of these reports. So it is interesting if you think about it, the script is kind of flipped. Okay. If you remember, 50% in the confidential report were in this category, and the other 50% was in here. But in this one, greater than 80% are in these regions, and then these kind of fall into this. Now, you might be asking, Dr. Peterson, this doesn't add up to 100%. Reason is that there is some crossover. So there's children who are neglected that are also physically abused. And so that's why this adds up to more than 100% if anyone's doing the math. So it's kind of interesting what's reported versus what individuals state confidentially that they experience. Um, and so those are some things to keep in mind. Okay. We should note that estimated childhood fatalities per day attributed to maltreatment, you will notice our highest rates in this area was between 2007 and 2009. And then they've slightly gone down, but they've been pretty much, if we were to, what we do is do what's called a predictive line. Okay, is a predictive line would say that maltreatment is on the increase and not the decrease based on this data. Okay. Now, more recent data, the last data that I've seen on childhood maltreatment was 2022, and it was at about, it was up here around this range of 4.8 again here in 2022. So it's stabilized on the higher end a little bit, but even well in today's, in the most recent data, it kind of sticks with this trend line that childhood maltreatment is still kind of on that increased or incline that we see. And some public health people have suggested this is maybe one of the reasons that the younger generations, Generation Alpha, generation then one after that, are choosing not to have children, and our birth rates in the United States have been reduced because of this increase of maltreatment in children that we've seen since about 2000. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about risk to of childhood abuse based on mother, father factors and risk fact and both. Okay. Um, for for child abuse, especially child sexual abuse, a child is at most risk based upon a mother's age. Okay. So a child who is born to a mother be, whose age is between the age of 18 to 23, or gives birth to a child between the age of 18 to 23, tends to be a um, uh, predictive probability that the highest predictability based on the mother of a child experiencing either physical or sexual abuse. Okay. And kind of an intervention or a prevention program that is kind of interesting to kind of ponder about is in the 1990s and early 2000s, the state of Hawaii had the highest childhood abuse and sexual abuse rates in the United States. Okay. One of the highest. I'm not, they're, for example, they were in the top five. And the state really wanted to do something about it. And so what they did is they implemented a new prevention strategy that was just coming out, and it was called a nurse visitation program. So when a mother came to a hospital and she was between the age of 18 to 23, she was assigned to a nurse visitor, okay, for the at least the first year of the infant's life, and then sometimes they transition to, for example, a social worker or something like that, depended upon the risk of the family. And for that first 12 months, the nurse would visit weekly or so and provide, basic health information, but they also were trained on providing parenting skills for the mother. Okay. And so that was implemented in the early 1990s. And by the early 2000s, the state of Hawaii went from one of the highest rates of childhood abuse to one of the lowest rates of childhood abuse in the United States. Okay. So there is something, and this class we really can't get into the weeds about it. There's something about the age of the mother and the maybe the parenting ability, caregiving ability, whatever it may be, between about the age of 18 to 23, that puts children at a higher risk of abuse than when children are born outside that age. Okay. For the father, and I do want to make this clear, there are other risk factors in both mothers and fathers. These tend to be the most predictive, okay, meaning that they statistically have the most predictive value. Okay. What we find with fathers is an absent father tends to put a child at higher risk. Um, a father who isn't there, who doesn't invest in the family, who is out, tends to put a child at more risk than a family who has a father. And I need to make this very clear, both for the mother and father. When we say an absent father, we're saying an absent healthy father. Okay. And so I just want everyone to kind of keep that in mind that when we talk about father as a risk factor, we're talking about father defined as a male role model in the family that provides uh, support for their children, boundaries for their children, is actively engaged with their children. And we find that the more absence of those defined fathering skills, the more at risk the child becomes. Okay. For both mother and father, these probably may look a little bit more um, 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 familiar to what is observed is stability in the relationship. So this is where, mom and dad are either living together or living apart, are constantly arguing and then constantly and then shift to incredibly in love without giving the child the ability to see that transition and how they resolve conflict. Constantly moving has been shown to have a factor on these two things. And then I want to make the differentiation between toxicity in a intimate relationship and toxicity between mother and father. Toxicity in the intimate relationship is that mom and dad maybe are very dysfunctional in their intimate engagements with each other. So maybe they're constantly arguing, fighting. They don't show much care for each other, those kinds of things. But also, intimate relationships apply to when a child is being raised in family homes where mom or dad brings in a toxic girlfriend or new spouse or something like that. And there's violence and name calling and all of those things, taking advantage of each other kind of things in those relationships. Toxicity between mother and father goes the same way. So, children tend to be at high risk of abuse. For example, when mothers and fathers go through a contentious, emotionally driven divorce, or they are unable to effectively co-parent with each other. Okay. Stability in the situation kind of goes back up to the stability of relationships. So having a consistent place. For example, individuals who constantly move are at higher risk. Research done in the military, where military personnel are constantly moved. We find that those military families that are moved more often tend to have higher rates of abuse of children. Okay. As response to stress and change, we kind of talked about that with toxicity. Education level. I want to make this one kind of clear. This has an association with child abuse. The higher educated the parent is, the less likely child abuse will occur in the home. However, this is not related to adult relationship abuse. A couple in with doctorate degrees are just at much risk of domestic violence as a couple who don't have high school degrees. The relationship between education and family violence tends to deal with childhood abuse and child abuse. View of being a parent, remember there is always disconnect between attitude, emotions, and actual behavior. I will tell you how many parents I've interviewed with and I've discussed with when I was working with children who were abused. I worked with children who were sexually abused, and there usually was not a parent who emotionally didn't think that they were bad parents. They loved being parents. Their children were everything. Their children meant the world to them, versus the actual behaviors that the children were experiencing. In the case that I worked, in the area that I worked with, it was sexual abuse of the child. So there is, so when we talk about the view of being a parent, we need to disconnect a parent's emotional attitude versus their behavior. So, because their view of being a parent on a behavioral context can be very different than their attitude about being a parent. Okay. And so when we talk about the risk factor of viewing of being a parent, we look at the parenting behavior versus the parent attitude. Okay. So those tend to be the dynamics of parents, and that conversation is always so interesting to have. We will go over protective factors, and when you go through the article on adverse childhood experiences, you'll read through protective factors that can buffer against the risk factors of abuse. So, for example, a child who has if we go back to this slide, a parent who has very toxic parents and unstable parents, if the child has the access to a stable grandparent or a stable uncle and aunt, that can often buffer some of the consequences of the instability of the mother and father. Um, some really interesting research when it comes to child sexual abuse is it's very interesting because everybody in this class can play a role in reducing the psychological and emotional effects of sexual abuse in children by saying some very simple words and following through with them. We can actually reduce the psychological and emotional consequences of childhood sexual abuse by saying these simple words. After a child has disclosed something to you, you say, I believe you, and I may not be able to stop what is happening to you, but I believe you, and I will do what I can to help. Those simple words from an adult, even if the adult may be powerless in doing much of anything about it, those simple words tend to be one of the number one protective factors that an adult can say to a child, and then do what you're capable of doing to reduce the psychological and emotional symptoms and consequences of child sexual abuse. Something to kind of consider if a child discloses to you about what's happening to them in that area. Okay, so something to consider. Anyways, okay. So with that note, I am going